Let me show you the most complex computer in the universe, the human brain. This organ designed these machines that run artificial intelligence today. Then it scaled them up, connected them, and turned them into giant data centers. These centers use massive amounts of electrical power on a megawatt scale, but the brain that designed them runs on about 20 watts of power, just like this light bulb. Actually, even this is too much. Let me dim the light like this. It corresponds to almost a dim light bulb. But isn't there something wrong with this? As we scale up machines, we consume massive amounts of energy. The brain, however, can run 86 billion neurons with this much power. So how could our brain be doing this? In the brain, electricity doesn't just mean a power source. The timing of these pulses is very important. When do those signals arrive, how long do they last, and with what rhythm do they repeat? These are like the language of the brain. This is how neurons communicate among themselves. So can a machine communicate with a neuron? I mean, if we produced an artificial neuron, could we teach it the language a real neuron understands? Scientists have achieved exactly this. I'll talk about that study, but first we need to focus on something really small. A single neuron? Don't think of a neuron as a simple wire, because electricity coming to a wire enters from one end and exits from the other. But in neurons, the situation is much more complex. A neuron first collects signals coming from its surroundings. When these signals overlap, a voltage builds up inside the cell. Once it crosses a certain threshold, the neuron suddenly fires and produces a short but powerful electrical pulse. In science, this is called a spike. But we're not just talking about a signal coming to a neuron here. The timing and rhythm of that signal are also important. Just like on a piano. If you press random keys, you get sound but not music, right? You need to press those keys at certain intervals with a certain rhythm. A similar situation applies to neurons as well. The pulses have a certain rhythm. The artificial neuron developed by the Northwestern team in the US can mimic exactly this rhythm. But first, let's clarify one thing. This thing we call an artificial neuron is not a real cell. It has no DNA, has no metabolism either. So scientists didn't produce a small brain cell or anything. They designed a device that produces neuron-like electrical pulses. But this device works differently from classic digital circuits. Chips in today's computers are very powerful, but not flexible and rhythmic like living tissue. This difference is important because a device that will work with the nervous system needs more than just electrical power. It also needs physical compatibility. Because living tissue doesn't behave like a hard piece of metal. It's soft, it moves, it changes shape. It is in constant contact with the surrounding tissues. Therefore, for an electronic device to work compatibly with the nervous system, sending signals is not enough. The structure carrying that signal must be able to adapt to the body, meaning it needs to be as flexible, lightweight, and compatible with biological tissue as possible. That's why the devices developed by the research team differ from classic silicon chips. These devices were produced by printing on a flexible surface using special electronic inks. They contain conductive materials like graphene and very thin semiconductor structures. The main thing is how electricity behaves within the structure. Electricity here doesn't flow like it does through a straight wire. Under some conditions, it has to pass through a very narrow, irregular path. This narrow path causes electricity to build up and cross a threshold. And when that threshold is crossed, a sudden electrical pulse is formed, just like in neurons. Then the system resets itself. So they work like a small electronic neuron that produces its own rhythm. While doing this, researchers turned what would normally be a defect into an advantage. Because in this type of printed electronics, there are residues in the ink that hold the structure together. Normally, many engineers want to clean these residues because they can disrupt the flow of electricity. But here, instead of completely eliminating that defect, the team used it in a controlled way. Electricity had to pass through those irregular narrow paths, and it was precisely these narrow passages that allowed the device to produce neuron-like pulses. So far, so good. The electronic structure was able to produce neuron-like pulses. But were living neurons really able to respond to this? This is the most critical detail of the research. Researchers tested the electrical signals from these artificial neurons on live tissue slices taken from a mouse brain. This distinction is important because we're not just talking about a model tested on a computer screen here. There is real living nerve tissue, but at the same time, it's not a ready-made device implanted in a human brain. So the study stands somewhere between theory and application. There's a real biological response in the lab, but no clinical application yet. The research team specifically looked at neurons in the cerebellum region in the study and saw this. The electrical pulses produced by the artificial neuron created an electrical response in real neurons. So the living cell didn't treat this signal like meaningless electrical noise. It gave a response. The signal was artificial, but the response was alive. Of course, by response, we're not talking about a conscious answer. There is no exchange of thoughts. There is no dialogue between the machine and the brain in the sense we understand, but the machine managed to knock on the door of the brain cell with the right rhythm. This difference seems small, but it's very important, because we're not just giving electricity to a neuron here. We're trying to form an electrical sentence in a rhythm it can understand. In a sense, the machine is sending a signal to the living cell in its own language. That's why this study isn't just an interesting lab experiment. A very critical door has been opened in brain-machine interfaces, because what we call an interface is actually the point of contact between two worlds. On one side, there is electronics, wires, voltages, circuits. On the other side is living nerve tissue, a variable, sensitive, and rhythm-sensitive structure. A translator is needed between the two so they can understand each other, but in many of today's systems, that translator works a bit crudely. The machine says, "I'll give you electricity, you react somehow." But with this new approach, the device says, "I'll send you a signal matching your natural electrical rhythm. Then you give me a response accordingly." The difference between the two is huge. And with this work, that crude translator has started to act more gently for the first time. For example, today, there are prosthetics that can be controlled by thought. Or there are some systems that try to send movement signals back to the muscles. These are used in paralyzed patients, but they all share a common problem. We can give electricity to the device, but we can't translate it into a language the nervous system understands. We can recall this from the example of Stephen Hawking. His mind was there, but his body had almost completely lost the connection that mind had with the world. Technology took that remaining tiny connection and turned it into sound. But there's an important distinction here. The system Hawking used wasn't reading his brain, nor was it establishing a direct electrical dialogue with his nervous system. It captured a very small movement left in the body and turned it into words. So, could technology one day directly approach the nervous system's own signal language without having to wait for that physical sign? A very concrete step was taken toward this question with the artificial neuron produced by scientists. A living neuron perceived the signal from the machine not as foreign noise, but as an understandable signal. This is the body-related side of it, but the same idea is also important for the future of computers. Inside today's computers, there are billions of transistors. You can think of them as very small on-off switches. They open and close. They process with zeros and ones. For years, we've tried to fit more processing power into the same area by shrinking these switches. But this also has physical limits. More transistors mean more heat. More heat means more energy and a greater need for cooling. Moreover, although this system is very powerful, it has a rather rigid architecture. The location of parts and the function of circuits are fixed. It's not a system that constantly rebuilds its own structure after leaving the factory. The brain, however, is a completely different structure, like a soft, three-dimensional living network that constantly changes its connections. When we learn something new, it's not just information being added. The brain's connections change too. The brain organizes information with a completely different architecture using very little power. The researcher's goal isn't actually to copy the brain exactly. It's to develop new systems that bring some of the brain's principles into the electronic world. If a system can work with different rhythms and pulse patterns instead of just turning on and off, it can process the same information more richly. This means computers that work more efficiently with less energy. Studies in this field are called neuromorphic electronics. In other words, we can call it brain-like electronics. But I want to repeat this specifically. None of this has anything to do with mind reading. We're not talking about consciousness transfer either. But even the fact that a living neuron can respond to a signal from an electronic system is a pretty exciting development. In fact, the whole story eventually comes back to this light bulb, because the power used by the human brain is roughly about this much. But that structure, powered by such little energy, sees, hears, learns, and it reminds us of this. Life doesn't always work with larger systems. Sometimes a more precise connection is needed, more sensitive timing, a more harmonious rhythm. And that's exactly why this study is so important. An electronic structure was able to produce a signal that a living neuron didn't find completely foreign. The great technologies of the future might not replace the brain, but they will learn to speak the same language, because life isn't just a machine waiting for commands. It's a rhythm that needs to be listened to. And perhaps, for the first time, technology has begun to hear that rhythm.